This program is brought to you by Emory University.
Good morning. My name is Marion Creekmore, and I'd like to welcome all of you here for this second day of our Emerging India Summit. This morning, we're going to talk about the regional and global challenges facing India. And for our discussion, we have brought together three experts on the regional and global challenges. In fact, three experts on India and Pakistan and many other things. All three of our guests have recently been in the area, and so they come back with firsthand experience. What I intend to do is to introduce our three panelists here at the outset, and then I'll sit down because you came to listen to them, not to me, and they will simply follow each other. I might also point out that each of our panelists, along with Jagdish Sheth in the audience, have written excellent books, and they're for sale outside, and I strongly recommend that all of you buy them. I'm sure they'd be happy to autograph them for you if you do so. First, let me introduce Ambassador Howard Schaffer. Howie spent most of his 36-year diplomatic career dealing with U.S. relations with South Asia. He served as U.S. Ambassador in Bangladesh, political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in New Delhi, India, and twice, and I think that's unprecedented, he was Deputy Assistant Secretary for South Asia in the Department of State. After retiring from the Foreign Service in 1991, I believe it was, Howie, he joined the Institute for the Study of Diplomacy at Georgetown University, where he now teaches undergraduate courses on the practice of diplomacy and U.S. policy toward South Asia. Ambassador Schaffer is the author of 3 books. His most recent is entitled The Limits of Influence, America's Role in Kashmir, and that's the one that's on sale outside. He has also just finished writing and will have published in April a book that he and his wife, the next person I will introduce, have written together, and it will be out in April, and I'm sure it will be a very significant work. It talks about the intractability of the relations between India and Pakistan. No, it doesn't. Turning then to Ambassador Teresita Schaffer, the wife of Howard Schaffer, Teasy, during her 30 years career in the U.S. Foreign Service, served in the U.S. embassies in Pakistan, in India, in Bangladesh, and from 1992 to 1995, she was the U.S. ambassador in Sri Lanka. In one of her Washington postings, she held the Deputy Assistant Secretary job for South Asia, the most senior position working on South Asia in the department at the time. She is also an expert on international economic issues. Ambassador Schaffer created and directed for 12 years the South Asian program at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington. She is currently a senior advisor to the strategic advisory firm McLarty Associates. Her most recent book, which is on sale outside, India and the United States in the 21st Century, is the leading work on the post-2000 U.S.-India relationship and its future prospects. As mentioned earlier, in April, she and Howie will have their new book out on Pakistan, Negotiating with Pakistan, a roller coaster ride. Professor Stephen Cohen, who will speak on last today, has a distinguished career as a teacher and scholar at the University of Illinois. He started working on South Asia, particularly India and Pakistan, in the 1960s. He has also taught in India, Singapore, and Japan. I first met Steve when he was recruited as a regional scholar to work on the Secretary of State's Policy Planning Council in the mid-1980s. Since the late 1990s, Steve has been the senior fellow for foreign policy studies at the Brookings Institution in Washington, working primarily on South Asia. He is a prolific author, having written and edited numerous books on Asian security issues, and he's currently working on a book dealing with the intractability of India and Pakistan. His most recently published book, On Sale Outside, has a wonderful title. It's about the Indian Defense Establishment. It's called Arming Without Aiming, India's Military Modernization, which he co-authored with Sunil Dasgupta, and again is outside today. Let me conclude my remarks by pointing out that these three experts, all personal close friends, have something else in common. Throughout their career, they have told me what to do. When I was in India in the early 1980s, Howie was my boss back in Washington, and he often sent me instructions by telephone at the time, usually around 2:30 in the morning, India time. His instructions were always crystal clear, but his sense of time zones was not. When I was in Sri Lanka in the early 1990s, my boss back in Washington was Schaffer. She gave me a lot of instructions about what to do, and every now and then what I should not do, as the time that I sent a cable to the Undersecretary for Political Affairs, which was somewhat above her rank in the State Department, without sending it to her first. She told me what her opinion of that action was, and I never did it again. In the 1980s, when I worked in the policy planning staff with Steve Cohen, in theory, I was Steve's supervisor. But since Steve had forgotten more about South Asia than I would ever learn, he told me what to do. And so this morning, I'm going to turn the tables on them. I'm going to tell them what to do. Howie, you speak first. Hazy, you speak second. Steve, you speak third. And then the audience and I are going to ask some tough questions. Thank you very much, Howie.
Now, folks, don't listen to this claim of false modesty. Marion had a great career in the Foreign Service. If I ever called him at 2:30 in the morning, he was certainly awake enough to challenge many of the orders, so-called orders, that I provided. In any event, it's great to see him. It's great to be here with all of you, and I'm particularly glad, as is my wife, that we've been able to come down here very soon, just a few days after our return from a trip, quite a dramatic trip, to India and Pakistan. That makes it possible that in my discussion I can draw on the many observations we made there. Steve, of course, is a very frequent flyer to South Asia, and he too will be able to reflect on his contacts there. Well, I want to talk to you today about the way that India is trying to deal with the challenges it faces in its own South Asian neighborhood, the innermost of the three concentric circles that comprise its strategic outlook, the one in which it has sought, never with total success, to win primacy and a veto over the actions of outside powers. My wife will then go on to talk about global challenges that India faces, and then Steve Cohen will talk about defense policy. The challenges India faces in dealing with its immediate neighbors are daunting. They range from the threat it perceives from Pakistan, much heightened in India's estimation by the Pakistan-supported attack on Mumbai in November 2008 and its aftermath, to the movements of illegal job-seeking migrants into India from Bangladesh, to the support insurgent groups contesting Indian government authority in border areas receive from organizations able to base themselves in nearby countries. They include the impact of the Afghanistan war on Indian interests, the growing disparity of economic growth between India and its neighbors, and China's efforts to expand its influence in the area. The list is a long one and is far more complicated than it was in the simpler years of the Cold War. In those years, India saw the Pakistanis bolstered from time to time by military, economic, and political assistance from the United States as its principal challenge within the region. In my discussion, I want to focus on Pakistan and the closely related issue of Afghanistan. Then I'll say a few words about the challenges and opportunities that India faces in the smaller countries of the region. Well, Pakistan continues to be seen by Indians as the greatest threat to it from within the region. Sometimes you talk to Indians and they develop a real nightmare scenario about Pakistan. That has a nuclear Pakistan controlled by Islamic extremists, support given by this Islamic Pakistan government to radical Islamic groups in India, heightened Pakistani support for activity against India in disputed Kashmir, an acceleration of the nuclear arms race, Pakistan's use of neighboring states to subvert Indian authority. The list goes on. Meanwhile, it's notable that Indian attitudes towards U.S. support for Pakistan has changed. Unlike the Cold War years, it's willing to live with massive U.S. support, hasn't tried to undercut that support or to make it a sticking point in U.S.-Indian relations. That's not to say the Indians welcome it, but they recognize that, as before, that Pakistan seeks equipment, military equipment from the United States that they can use against India rather than for the purposes for which it has been given. Nor it's fair to say, do Indians relish the importance that Pakistan's role in the Afghan war and the war against terrorism has given it for the United States. But Indians have shown that they can live with this strong U.S. support for Pakistan, confident as they are in the more vibrant nature of Washington's ties with New Delhi, not to speak of Mumbai, Hyderabad, and Bangalore. Most Indians will tell you that India wants to live at peace with a stable, prospering, and well-governed Pakistan, one that does not cause problems for India at home, especially sponsorship of terrorist acts. Such a Pakistan would preferably, but not necessarily, be a democratic one. India would like to see greater trade and investment, settlement of border and other disputes, and of course a solution to the vexing Kashmir problem about which I've written. Many, probably most Pakistanis doubt that India has such benign objectives towards Pakistan. Many of them see an existential threat coming from India and argue that despite the passage of over 60 years of independence, India does not fully recognize Pakistan as a sovereign state and harbors ill intentions against it. But India is in no hurry to pursue these objectives. It's the status quo power in Kashmir. It controls the part of Kashmir which matters, that is the Kashmir Valley. And there's little domestic political pressure for progress on other items on the bilateral India-Pakistan agenda. For over 2 years, India was unwilling to resume the composite dialogue broken off by the Mumbai attacks as Pakistanis stonewalled Indian efforts to have the Mumbai suspects brought to trial. It abandoned this position only recently. The speculation is why it did so. One is that it became clear that this strategy wasn't working and may even have become counterproductive. U.S. urging for a resumption of talks, I think, was also important. And some Indians speak about the legacy that Manmohan Singh, the Prime Minister of India, wishes to leave behind him in the form of improved relations between India and Pakistan. He was himself born in what subsequently became Pakistan. But even so, few in either India or Pakistan believe that the resumed talks will bring about a breakthrough anytime soon. The possibility of progress has probably been complicated by the weakness of governments in both New Delhi and Islamabad. There's need for strong governments to make the concessions necessary to bring about progress. In any event, the two countries have not reinstituted the backstairs, behind-the-scenes diplomacy where progress was made when President Musharraf offered out-of-the-box concessions that sharply differed from Pakistan's traditional positions. And I think until that happens, until these behind-the-scene talks are resumed, we can't expect much to go forward of any consequence. The danger in this situation is that another terrorist attack could lead to sharp Indian counteraction. Many Indians, including some very sober establishment figures, had demanded retaliation following what the Indians call 2611. It's hard to believe that this could be resisted a second time. And of course, there are many spoilers in Pakistan, and maybe some in India too, who would like to see that happen. In the meantime, I expect India will maintain its present strategy, keep strong forces on the border, keep a watchful and troubled eye on Pakistan's expansion of its nuclear arsenal, and worry about Chinese support for the Pakistan nuclear program. I'm sure that Steve Cohen will have a lot more to say about that. And probably India will, at least at a low level, provide covert support for movements in Balochistan and perhaps Sindh too in Pakistan that seek independence or greater autonomy for their provinces and thus keep Pakistani military forces tied up at home. Let me say a few words about Afghanistan. Pakistan's designs to carve out a so-called strategic depth for itself in Afghanistan are anathema to India. New Delhi strenuously opposes any post-war arrangement for Afghanistan that would make it a Pakistani client state and seriously diminish, if not eliminate, any Indian influence there. Indians will tell you that what they want is a political settlement, perhaps arranged and guaranteed by a concert of neighboring and major powers that would bring about a stable, non-aligned Afghanistan. But such a strategy, welcome as it would be in New Delhi, would face serious, probably insurmountable obstacles, as many Indians seem to understand. But the Indians, in my view, would also cheerfully accept a reversion to the situation before 1978, when the Pakistani and Afghan governments were on bad terms, disputed the border, as they still do, and Kabul caused problems for Pakistan in Pashtun and Baluch areas within Pakistan. In any event, many Indians believe, in my view correctly, that the Pakistanis will have a hard time making even a Taliban-led state into a permanent client unless such a state is placed beyond the pale, as the Taliban regime was by the international world in 1996 to 2001. In any event, India can't do much to influence the political or military situation in Afghanistan at this time. It recognizes that some outreach to the Taliban is probably inevitable, unpalatable as this will be for Indian interests. It's a major contributor to international efforts to rebuild Afghanistan. It operates an important economic and social aid program which has attracted a lot of favorable attention among Afghans. It does not aspire to play a military role in Afghanistan. It's interested in exploiting Afghan mineral resources, especially the country's iron ore reserves. India's consular presence has been a matter of much public slanging between New Delhi and Islamabad, which is deeply suspicious of any role in any Indian role in Afghanistan. India maintains 4 consulates as well as its embassy in Kabul. That embassy was the target of a bombing attack that U.S. officials blamed on terrorists based in Pakistan. The Pakistanis routinely exaggerate the activities and the number of these Indian consulates and claim that they are nests of agents who provide covert help to separatist elements in Balochistan and Sindh. The Indians, of course, deny any such activity. India's broad goals in Afghanistan are a dismantled Afghan Taliban, a decently governed, preferably democratic state with normal relations with New Delhi, and better transport and economic ties through Afghanistan into Central Asia. During the Afghan Civil War of the 1990s, India maintained close relations with the Northern Alliance, the principal rival to the Taliban, and provided it with support. Now the Indians firmly back the Karzai government. They don't engage in the frequent public criticism of it, so typical of U.S. officials and other American commentators. Indians ask, who else is there? And they come up dry. New Delhi is watching with some concern U.S. plans for a future American presence and the moves towards negotiations with elements of the Taliban. It would like to see the U.S. and NATO remain on the ground as long as possible. It seems to have painfully accepted that Pakistan must play some role in an eventual Afghanistan settlement, and recently suggested that New Delhi and Islamabad talk about Afghanistan as part of their composite dialogue. The Pakistanis, however, are unlikely to accept this Indian offer. Let me turn now briefly to the smaller countries of the region. India has made a major effort to improve relations with these smaller South Asian countries. Concern about an expanding Chinese footprint in these nations has been an important element in Indian thinking, but I would argue it's not been the driving force in New Delhi's approach. And I'm talking about things like Chinese development of a railroad across the Himalayas from Tibet to Kathmandu, the building by China of a large new seaport in Sri Lanka, and increased aid, economic aid, and cultural contact throughout the region. Some analysts hold that India has concluded that a good neighbor policy will contribute to India's economic boom. And I see this particularly in the case of India's relations with Bangladesh, frequently very poor despite India's role in the liberation of the country from Pakistan in 1971. The Indian and Bangladeshi governments agreed last year to what they called interconnectivity. And this would mean that the smaller Indian states in the northeastern part of the country would, for the first time since the 1960s, actually have access to the sea through Bangladesh rather than to have to go the long way round through the narrow neck of northeastern India till they get to the port of Calcutta. And this would obviously bring huge benefits to both countries. It's moving forward slowly, as usually happens in such matters. Let's hope, however, that it gains speed despite bureaucratic inertia and the concern among some Bangladeshis that it damages Bangladesh's national interest. Another important point I think in explaining why India is seeking this better relationship with the small countries is that it wants to see smaller countries cooperate in suppressing anti-Indian terrorist activities based in their areas, and they're making good progress there. And finally, such an improved relationship will surely enhance New Delhi's image as a responsible global power. Well, I certainly hope that India will continue these efforts among the smaller countries and further diminish earlier concerns shared in these countries that it is prone to bully these neighbors rather than to cooperate with them. Well, India lives, as my remarks have suggested, in a dangerous neighborhood. I hope that it will continue to respond flexibly and imaginatively to the problems it deals with in the region as it looks to the broader world and the enhanced role it is determined to play there. And with that note, I'll close and turn to my wife, who will talk about that greater world.
Well, thank you, Howie, and thank you, Ambassador Creekmore, for your warm and generous introduction. But Ambassador Creekmore left out one element, which is the fact that I succeeded him as ambassador to Sri Lanka. So I had the opportunity in a very up-close and personal way to see what a wonderful steward he was of U.S. interests in that country, and what a well-run embassy he left me to inherit. I've taken on the job of talking about India's global challenges. If we'd been having this conference 20 years ago, I'm not sure the subject would have been on the agenda. Now it's inevitable. And I'm going to talk about India's global challenges under three broad headings. The first, which may sound strange, but I will argue that it's highly pertinent, is the challenge of India's economy. The second is the key regions in which India is engaged and in which it is exercising its greater global footprint. And the third is the multilateral world. One of the things that happened in the great turnaround of India's domestic economy and its foreign policy that first became apparent after 1990 was that those two categories merged. As India's economy started growing faster, it also became one of the principal drivers of India's foreign policy. In the 1950s and 60s, if somebody had said India's foreign policy is driven by economics, they would have been talking about the business of getting aid. Today, you're not talking about aid. You're talking about trade, investment, and energy. And this has had a profound impact on the way India conducts its foreign policy. For starters, India's economy, long one of the world's most isolated, has become much more integrated. Trade is upwards of 40% of India's GDP. It was in the low teens in the late 1980s. Big change in the way the economy is driven. Secondly, not only are its international relationships more diversified, as we will see in detail in a minute, but India has now concluded free trade areas with ASEAN, Korea, and Japan. There are 5 million Indians in the Persian Gulf. Oil is India's largest import, not terribly surprising. It works out to about 1/3 of India's imports. It's also, somewhat less well-known factoid, India's largest export. Refined petroleum products amount to about 1/6 of India's exports. So that it's deeply engaged economically, again, with the countries of the Persian Gulf, who are big purchasers of refined petroleum refined in India. One could go on, but I won't in the interests of time. But the importance of India's economy as a factor that has positioned India for a bigger role in the world, as a determinant of the size and vibrancy of its relations with the United States, and as a factor in the way Indian security officials think about Indian national security, is tremendous. Second category of global challenges involve India's interests in and relationships with a number of key parts of the world. And I'm going to look at these from the inside out. Obviously, the first tier is the one my husband has already spoken of. I'm not going to go over that groundwork again. But the India in South Asia subject used to basically define the way Americans looked on India's major foreign policy interests. I'm exaggerating, but only slightly. Now, when you look beyond the immediate South Asian neighbors from the inside out, the first thing you come to is the Indian Ocean, which has become increasingly prominent in India's security view of the world. It is, in a sense, the bridge between India's regional and its global interests. It is the pathway for vital energy imports. It's the arena for a growing Indian role in enhancing security beyond its immediate South Asian region, and it is the area of most intense security cooperation between India and the United States. When I was in charge of South Asia policy in the State Department, I have vivid memories of a couple of conferences that were held between our National War College and the counterpart institution in India. There was one in Washington, and a year later there was one at the Indian War College in Pune. And in both cases, the guys in the white suits, the navies, were the ones who were most suspicious of one another. Now, that has been completely turned on its head. Beyond the Indian Ocean, and obviously I'm going pretty quickly here I'm trying to sketch out a big picture rather than to give you details of each relationship. The next key region, I would say, is East Asia. And I will make a couple of observations here. First, that India's economic relationships in East Asia have gone up dramatically. China is India's biggest trading partner for goods. As you heard Ambassador Schaffer say last night, if you include services trade, then the United States is still in #1 place. But it's been the area where India has had the most dramatically changing policies towards trade with all those free trade areas. And India has become much more actively involved in trying to insert itself into what you might call the East Asia-centered clubs, the various regional organizations, many of them centered on ASEAN. The other thing that's happened is that the United States has increasingly for the past year been talking about India in the Asian context. This has been an explicit statement in a great number of high-level statements about U.S.-India relations. And this has happened at a time of considerable friction between India and China. So you have an India-China relationship which is both more important economically and, frankly, more tense from a security point of view. What does this mean? Well, what it does not mean is some kind of effort on the part of the United States and India to become allies in a triangular game against China. What it does mean, however, is that both countries have a common interest in ensuring that China isn't the only big kid on the East Asian bloc. And this is an illustration of a more general point I'd like to leave with you, which is that the interests of India and the United States have begun to converge in ways that both governments are conscious of, and that this has become another driver of the U.S.-India relationship, in addition to the economic ties that I mentioned a minute ago. Third key area, the Persian Gulf. Considered by Indians to be part of their security perimeter, as I already mentioned, critical economic relationships. The current head of the Indian Navy, when he was deciding what countries to visit when he was newly appointed, made his first visit to the UAE. Again, important converging interests with the United States, but also important points of difference. The principal, for instance, in that category being Iran, where India and the United States share an interest in Iran not developing nuclear weapons, but have very different ideas of how to go about it. So you have India with very well-developed interests in the Persian Gulf, the United States as well, but in this case, a significant difference that the two will need to manage. Beyond the regions that I've just described, you have what you might call the horizon of India's future global involvement, and here let me very briefly mention two examples. One is Africa, where India's commercial interests are rapidly increasing and where the United States has recently agreed with India to try to find some cooperative ventures on the what you might call the borderline between aid giving and commercial development. And Latin America, which traditionally was an area where India had really no interests apart from the sort of general business of having a lot of countries that were members together with India of the non-aligned movement, and where again you have a quite active Indian commercial presence in a number of countries, principally Brazil, and emerging ties. I don't want to overstate this. Neither Africa nor Latin America is the real hotspot in Indian foreign policy, but my point is there's something going on there where 20 years ago there was not. The third category of India's global challenges is the multilateral world. Now, speaking as a former American diplomat, I would have to say that in general, the multilateral world has been the disaster area of U.S.-Indian international dealings. Different organizations for different reasons. The United Nations, and principally the General Assembly, was the place where India basically worked on punching its non-aligned ticket. India has voted with the United States in the General Assembly somewhere between 15 and 20% of the time. Now, that's not significantly different from other developing countries, but it's not one of those percentages that's going to make the U.S. Congress feel all warm and fuzzy. In the World Trade Organization, we've had similarly difficult relationships. Those, I think, are largely based on quite different interests, particularly short-term interests, in the particular trade issues under discussion. I would suggest to you that this is beginning to change. And I'll offer you two examples of that change. The first is the G20, the Group of 20, this relatively new international organization that emerged about 2 years ago and is really becoming the premier organization for global financial management. India is a member of the group. India fields a dream team of very talented economists who also happen to have jobs like Prime Minister. And this has been a relatively harmonious place for India and the United States to work together. In other words, we're developing a different experience of multilateral cooperation. The second example is even more interesting. Many of you may be aware that when President Obama visited Delhi last November, one of the things he announced was that the United States would support India's permanent membership in a reformed United Nations Security Council. Now, he said this just at the time that India was joining the Security Council for a 2-year term. This is the first time in 20 years that India has been on the Security Council. You're going to hear from my friend and former colleague Jeff Pyatt, who's sitting quietly in the audience at lunch and who will give you the proper official word on this. I would suggest to you, being nice and unofficial, that this was something of a leap of faith on the president's part. Because there's very little in our experience of the UN that would give us confidence that the United States and India will routinely find themselves comfortably on the same side of everything that comes before the Security Council. However, it was also the expression, I think, of two beliefs. One is that if you're serious about global management and serious about the Security Council as one of the places where that takes place, India needs to be inside the tent, not outside it. And the second is that as India becomes more prosperous, more internationally active, it will have a more complex view of its interests, and India and the United States will together develop the techniques for dealing both with the issues we agree on and with those that we start out not agreeing on. This is likely to be a bumpy process, and we will undoubtedly have some difficult moments in the next 2 years on the Security Council. But that is where I see the U.S.-India relationship headed. And let me just close with a few thoughts on that. Again, you're going to get the longer and more complete story over lunch. But I believe that what I've just sketched out as India's global challenges come at a time when the United States has been really recognized for somewhere between 10 and 20 years as India's most important external relationship. I think this is a tremendously important change in Indian foreign policy, but it also reflects a change in how the U.S. government views its interests. As I wrote in the book that Marion Creekmore so kindly mentioned, I think that we have the potential for a tremendously important and strategic partnership. But in order to realize that potential, I think we are also going to have to redefine what partnership means, because neither India nor the United States has a history of doing partnership that really fits the needs of both of those countries. So with that thought, let me turn the mic over to Steve Cohen, who's going to talk more specifically about India's defense policy.
Thank you, Tacy. Let me first of all thank Ambassador Creekmore, Marion, as we used to know him. He was my boss for a couple of years in the State Department. I came out from academia, knew nothing about government at all, nothing about diplomacy, but he taught me how to function. Well, he didn't always agree with what I said and what I wrote, but he was an enormous inspiration and teacher. And I think it was interesting that at those 2 years, 85 to 87, two events took place which sort of indicated where the world was heading, where we were headed with regard to South Asia. One was Rajiv Gandhi had just made a visit to Washington right just before I showed up, and that was a failed effort by both countries to normalize the U.S.-India relationship. It had begun under Mrs. Gandhi, and Rajiv tried to push it, but there were other factors which intervened. One of the factors was our close relationship with Pakistan at the time, and under the umbrella of a new U.S.-Pakistan alliance, 85, 87, after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Pakistanis moved ahead with a nuclear weapons program. And I came in, I think Arnie Rafel brought me in to facilitate the second U.S.-Pakistan aid package, but I wound up writing most of my memos about the nuclear issue. And I think now that we know that there's at least 100 Pakistani nuclear weapons, and Pakistan as a state is beginning to loosen at the seams, how critically important that development was, and in a sense, I think it represented a massive failure on American policy to either stop the Pakistan nuclear program or to persuade the Pakistanis to do something else. That, of course, created an enormous problem for the Indians, and I'll talk about that briefly. But I really want to organize a very brief presentation in a couple of ways. I sat through the presentations yesterday, so I want to begin by talking about globalization and Indian defense. I think that's an important historical point, which very few people are aware of. Then also speak briefly about branding, the Indian brand, especially in the military and defense area. Talk about two major factors which are sort of transforming the relationship, Indian defense policy, and then conclude by talking about four challenges that Indian defense and strategic community face. Let me begin with globalization, and I think I could argue sort of a new research project for me. I began it in 1963. I think I can argue that one of the first examples of true globalization, that is the transfer of technology and ideas and organizational patterns from the West to elsewhere, took place in the 18th century. In a sense, Lord Clive's army, the Indian Army, was really the first and most successful example of the transfer of technology, not military technology, but military organizational technology, because the British found themselves facing the French in South Asia. And what they did was, as good imperialists will do, is they ripped off an idea that the French had invented, which was called the sepoy system. And the sepoy system basically is you get Indian peasants and you train them up to a Western standard of discipline, and you put Western officers in command of those Indian peasantry. And of course, at that time, the peasantry was largely Tamil, the martial races of Tamil Nadu, which K. Subramaniam later talked about. So in a sense, that was an enormously successful innovation. So the British sent out generation after generation of young Brits to become officers in the Indian Army, and that system operated right to 1947. There were still young Brits going out to India in 47, 45, 46, 47 to lead Indian soldiers, although by that time, of course, middle-class Indians were joining the army. So the British used that army, the Indian Army, although it had three components, Bengal, Madras, and Bombay, to first defeat the French, in a sense, defeating the French with a French organizational innovation, which was a remarkable example, I think, of radical globalization, the first wave of globalization. And secondly, to defeat all Indian rivals, including the Mughal Empire. So I think that's not really widely recognized, but it was a brilliant adaptation to circumstances. And I think the interesting thing about it, I'll talk about this a little bit further, was that this was done by a private company. East India Company was apparently the largest private company in history. And it had its own army, eventually had its own air force and navy. And in a sense, it was a very successful operation. And it resulted in an Indian military now, which is not one of the world's best, but certainly up in the top quarter of militaries around the world. A disciplined, organized military with features largely derived from the British, which really make it an effective military establishment in the South Asian context. I'd also add that the same pattern was followed by Pakistan when the countries split, then by Bangladesh. And really, of the armies of the world, it's hard to find three armies with the kind of integrity and organizational competence as India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh. They differ in some important ways. So really, this globalization, first wave of globalization, transformed the world, because the British then used the Indian Army to, in a sense, dominate the Persian Gulf, because there weren't enough British soldiers to do it. And then they used the Indian Army to exercise influence in Africa. And finally, World War I and World War II. The British could not have functioned effectively as a combatant in those two world wars without a huge Indian contribution. And one of the ironies of this is that Indian diplomats now claim that India fought on the side of the Allies during World War II. And they point to this million-man Indian Army. It was and is the largest volunteer army in history. The irony is, of course, is that the Indian nationalists either fought against the British and the Indian Army or else went to jail. They were neutral. Gandhi went to jail, Nehru went to jail, and they sat out the war as non-combatants. They didn't want the Japanese to win, but they didn't want they certainly didn't want they were lukewarm about the British winning. But the Indian Army was a critical development factor in this. K. Subramaniam, in fact, according to his grandson, as a young man in Chennai, in Madras in the 1940s during World War II, he argued that the Japanese should be defeated. Very unusual among Indians. He was in favor of the British winning the war because he said, if the Japanese won the war, India will never get independence, whereas the British would eventually give independence to India, which they did. So that's globalization. In a sense, the Indian military today, especially the Army, but also the Air Force and the Navy, represent an enormous transfer of Western organizational capacities adapted to Indian circumstances. And I think the adaptation process was particularly interesting, although it still remains an 18th century Army. As I said, the nationalists had other views about this. And one aspect of that transfer of an idea, of an organizational concept from Britain to India was it included, as far as the Indians were concerned, and this happened late in the Raj, not early in the Raj, civilian control over the military. By the 1940s, actually 1920s, the British had decided that the Indian Army would be controlled by British civilians and eventually Indian civilians in the Indian Civil Service. And the notion of a military-dominated empire in India was ruled out. And I won't go into the details of this, but so the British legacy included civilian control over the military right up to 47, and of course the Indians continued with that with a vengeance. In Pakistan, they followed an earlier British Raj tradition, and that is a much larger military presence in decision-making. And you've seen the two countries go these different ways in terms of the role of the military in policy and politics. Let me say a word or two about branding, because I thought that was really neat conversation about branding. Also, go back again. Globalization has its negative consequences also, and as we talked today about the importance of globalization. Well, the bad guys are globalized as well as the good guys, and from the Indian nationalist point of view, the British invention of an army in India was a negative because that enabled the British to dominate Indian politics for 100+ years. So from an Indian nationalist point of view, the Indian Army was anathema, but they kept it and they preserved it, and I think wisely they decided that it was not worthwhile getting a people's army or some kind of other indigenous army stick with the British pattern because it did work. Let me say a few words about branding. And in this context, note that the East India Company has been revived as a brand in UK. And you can buy all kinds of East India Company memorabilia. I'm not sure if they're going to raise their own army now, but it's an interesting niche. This company has risen from the dead after being killed off in 1857 to function again as a brand. We associate Indian defense policy, well, we don't associate India with defense policy. Historically, we associate India with Gandhi, nonviolence, pacifism, and so forth, not neutral in that. But Gandhi was actually a fan of the military. He didn't like the military using force, but he did like the discipline and ordered structure of the Army. And I'm surprised that nobody in this conference has mentioned the Martin Luther King Center here, Ebenezer Baptist Church, because our own history as a democracy was profoundly shaped by Gandhi's ideas towards nonviolence. It picked up by King and applied here. So I think that India's military history is twofold. That is, we tend to stereotype India as a pacifist, nonviolent country. Actually, there's plenty of domestic violence in India, but as a state that it's not a militarized state, which is true. But we sort of ignore the fact that it's always been a major military power. I was talking to Jaswant Singh this last visit, and he said he agreed with Field Marshal Auchinleck, who I talked to when I was a graduate student 45 years ago, that the division of the old Indian Army destroyed the strategic unity of South Asia. And from that point onward, in a sense, outside powers were not welcome, but could intervene in South Asia. First the Brits, then the Americans, now the Chinese have a major military presence or relationship in South Asia. And the Indians have not been able to figure out a way of undoing that loss of strategic unity that the British left them. So I'd say that it is true, though, and this is one of the arguments we make in the book, Arming Without Aiming, and if you understand the title, you don't have to buy the book. I can save you a lot of money, but I will be giving a PowerPoint presentation on the book, I guess later this afternoon. It is true, though, that, and my co-author and I use the term strategic restraint, except for two major military operations, Indian military has not been used extensively. The first was, of course, in 1971, which K. Subramaniam said publicly was the opportunity of a century. And I teased Subbu once, I said, well, we've got a new century. Maybe is there a new opportunity to do away with Pakistan? And he got into trouble for saying that, but it was probably the right thing to do from the Indian point of view. Of course, the Pakistanis have never forgiven or forgotten what he said about the opportunity to destroy Pakistan. And so that was an unqualified success, except that Indians did not figure out how to normalize relations after the military victory with Pakistan. They failed to bring the Pakistanis around, make the kind of concessions necessary so that Pakistan would not be an antagonist, but would be, if not an ally, at least a neutral power. What happened was that the Pakistan military and many Pakistani civilians took the defeat of 1971 as a goal to overcome, that they would get the revenge on the Indians one way or another. And they've done this, in fact, through various kinds of operations. So in a sense, it was a military victory, but I think a strategic failure. They failed to bring about the accommodation of India and Pakistan strategically. They had another opportunity to do this in 1987 with the brass tacks crisis, but they held back at the last moment. They did not want to start a war with Pakistan. And that was the last moment they could have had a war with Pakistan and won without the region, without a nuclear war as a consequence. The other major military operation was the invasion of Sri Lanka on behalf of the Indian-Sri Lanka arrangement, and Ambassador Schaffer, and actually both of them surrounded by ambassadors who know more about that than I do, but it was, from an Indian point of view, the Indian Vietnam. It was an overseas adventure just across the Palk Straits, which was complete catastrophe. And Indian soldiers are still, retired officers are still bitter about that. So their experience as an active military power has been mixed. In the one case, 71 cut the Pakistanis down to size, but they never really followed up with a strategic accommodation with Pakistan. In the course of Sri Lanka, it was their Vietnam. They left an incredibly bitter taste in their mouth. Now let me talk now just about two major factors that have transformed the Indian defense scene. And a lot of this is in the book, and I'll cover some of this in the PowerPoint, so I can be very brief. First of all, there's more money available. As India becomes wealthy, the defense budget naturally grows. It grows to the point where they don't know how to spend it. And most of that defense budget goes into pay and retirement benefits. But they do have stockpiled away billions of dollars to buy new hardware. And of course, those billions of dollars, which I'll talk about later, represent one of the largest potential arms sales in history, $10 billion for an airplane, plus other billions for new ships and armor and re-equipment, the Indian military. So there's more money available for the first time in history. Indian policymakers can think of doing something and buying something and acquiring things without worrying about the breaking the bank because the money is there. Although still the debate goes on in India about guns versus butter, and there's deep resentment among parts of Indian society to any defense spending at all, let alone massive defense spending. Secondly, and I'll talk about, I don't want to repeat what both Ambassador Schaffer just said, but there's a wide spectrum of threats facing India. Of course, you have a threat when you have a National Security Council that invents threats. You know, the day that I was told that the day Thailand created a National Security Council, that's the day it became insecure. In other words, the job of security councils is to invent threats, keep themselves in business. So you have to see which of these threats are real, which are imaginary. And sometimes preparing to meet an imaginary threat can create a real threat in opposition. I won't go into the nuances of this, but I'd say that India faces, not uniquely but importantly, as does Pakistan and China and the U.S., a wide spectrum of military problems. Some are threats and some are not threats. First of all, there's the old perennial, a conventional war with Pakistan. Won't go into the details, but the existence of nuclear weapons makes that less and less likely. I published a book a couple of years ago called Four Crises in a Peace Process, and we talk about the likelihood of another conventional war with Pakistan. The Pakistanis, of course, are deeply persuaded that Indians intend to attack them out of the blue, the next war. So they are preparing for the next war with India, a war that India is probably not thinking about. So there is a possibility of a conventional large-scale war with Pakistan. The two countries have among the largest armored forces in the world, but I think those are going to be allowed to deteriorate, and they'll be put on these roundabouts in both the Indian and Pakistani cities. Secondly, there's possibility of a limited land war with China. It's still a contested border. There's still grievances on both sides. As Ambassador Shankar said yesterday, it's pretty much regularized, but there's a section of Indian hawkdom and Chinese hawkdom that sees the border as an opportunity to go the other, to hurt the other, and there's always a chance of some low-level military functionary getting out of control. But I don't regard that as a likely threat, as possible threat, especially as long as the border remains undefined. Thirdly, India is deeply involved, and this is a real problem. The whole military and the million-man paramilitary deeply involved with unconventional war at the lower level within India. India now has 2 or 3 active insurgencies. They've been fighting the Nagas since the 1950s, I guess. There's a struggle in Kashmir. Other groups are rising up. And of course, you have the new phenomenon of the Naxalites, sort of left-wing Maoist guerrillas challenging the Indian states, especially on the East Coast. So that's a military problem of some significance. In fact, we have a Indian Army brigadier associated with Brookings just recently, and he's been in combat almost his whole career. Besides the occasional war with Pakistan, fighting guerrillas and separatists and radical separatists in India itself. So in a sense, there's this limited unconventional war, low-intensity conflict raging all through India, not all at once, but from time to time, blazes up and goes down. And of course, this has made the Indian Army one of the best armies in the world in terms of counterinsurgency strategy. They've had a huge amount of experience. And on the Brookings website, my co-author actually did a study of this for the benefit of the Pakistanis. The Pakistanis had no understanding of what counterinsurgency was. They're still learning how to do it. So Sunil actually put up on the website, it's on a website, a paper which points out the Indian experience, what lessons there might be for Pakistan. I doubt if any Pakistanis read those, but that's another issue. Fourthly, there is really an opportunity for the Indian Navy to, in a sense, assert itself as a major naval power in the Indian Ocean. And as that Ambassador Schaffer said, the two navies wore daggers drawn for years. They couldn't stand each other. And I remember being brought over, I don't know if you went with me, to our Navy Yard to talk to our admirals. And I said, I told them I lived in Vizag for a year, and I didn't see any Soviet ships coming in or out. And they looked at me as if I was from the moon. What was a State Department official living in Vizag? Well, I was there as an academic, and really there were no Soviet vessels there, but the Indian Navy had become so glued to the Soviet Navy that their attitudes towards the U.S. Navy were deeply hostile, and ours towards them were deeply hostile, but now they actually love each other. There's a love fest between the two navies. Finally, besides sea power, India's been involved in a lot of UN peacekeeping operations around the world. I think one of the big challenges and questions about India is will move from peacekeeping to peacemaking? Will they use this army as a force to stabilize unstable countries, or will they simply go in when a peace agreement has been reached? I don't know, and I think that's one of the big questions, because the Indian Army has this capability to operate overseas in a peacemaking format as well as peacekeeping format. So does the Pakistan Army. So let me talk about 4 difficulties or challenges to the Indian defense process, and I'll just run through them very quickly. There is a crisis in acquisition. They can't figure out how to spend the money, and I'll talk about that later on because it's a sort of a constipated acquisition system. They just can't, they're afraid to buy in large quantities. But they do understand that the Israelis are good providers. They have a traditional relationship with the Russians. But when it comes to the Americans, they still have some problems. They're groping for a strategic policy. For years, the Indians functioned under a Nehruvian image of the world. Don't get involved, be non-aligned, it's not our problem, stay home. But now, in a post-Nehruvian era, there's a group of strategists trying to figure out how to create a grand strategy for India. And for the first time in their history, Indians are writing about grand strategy. Sometimes well, sometimes badly, but at least they're doing it. And I think there's a ferment and a debate going on in India, which is very, very important. Thirdly, their defense policy process excludes the military. And there was a civil-military bargain under Nehru, where the military stayed out of politics completely, and they've been pretty good at that. And then the politicians stayed out of military affairs. And this has made it difficult to integrate military thinking and military ideas in the policy process. Our system is probably too much tilted in the direction of the military, but still there's a balance. Maybe the British are the best model to follow. But the Indians exclude the armed forces from these important decisions. And even worse problem, and I think it's by design, not by accident, so the armed forces regard each other as their major enemy. The Army competes with the Air Force, competes with the Navy, and then later on they worry about Pakistan and China. So it's an inter-service rivalry, which makes ours look like, you know, it's dysfunctional for India. Thirdly, I think I got the right numbers, yeah. Up to 4, okay, then fourthly, there's civilian incompetence in defense matters. There's nobody in the Indian political community that understands defense policy except for 2 people. When we wrote the book, we'd go around and talk to military and politicians, and I'd hold up my hands and say, give me the names of the civilian politicians who understand something about defense policy, and I'd take one hand down. So invariably, I'd get Jaswant Singh, Arun Singh, a former friend of Rajiv, Congress Party associate of, and then they'd look up at this guy and say, well, there's others too, we'd think. So there really isn't anybody except for Jaswant and Arun, who's sitting up in a hill in the mountains in Binsar. He's out of politics. So they lack civilian expertise. There's enormous Indian expertise on trade, business, economics, investment, whole range of skills among the politicians, but not in defense and military policy. So when it comes to a military or strategic decision, the civilians feel a little nervous about this. And in terms of the civilian bureaucracy, the Indian Administrative Service, they are often no help at all. A lot of them have had very little experience. And K. Subramaniam, I think there's a virtual program about him here. He was about the only one of the very few defense ministry officials who understood this as a problem. Finally, and I just mention, I don't have to discuss it. There's the new strategic partnership with the United States. You have a generation of Indian politicians, and even more so a generation of Indian bureaucrats who came to maturity regarding the United States as one of the 3 major enemies of India, China and Pakistan being the other. And in the 1970s and to some extent the 80s, the U.S., China, Pakistan axis was the major threat. Now, you don't get rid of these ideas quickly. In a sense, you have to grow and understand that the world changed after 1989, 1990. Subramaniam understood this, but very few of his colleagues understood it as well. So I think there's a learning process going on in India about how to deal with the United States effectively. And with that, let me stop and thank you very much.
Thank you both, all three, for excellent presentations, and we're going to open the floor for questions. I'd like to ask maybe one question of each of the panelists and then throw it to the audience. And taking them in the order that you made your presentations. Howie, you've talked about what India was doing in Afghanistan, a little bit about what Pakistan did not like what it was doing. To what extent do you think India takes into account the Pakistan sensitivities, perhaps over-sensitivities, about its actions in Afghanistan, and thereby does it limit or not things that it might otherwise do?
Well, I think India is very aware of Pakistani sensitivities in Afghanistan. As I said in my remarks, what the Indians do not want to see in Afghanistan is a Pakistan-dominated client state or anything like it. Sure, but being aware of these sensitivities doesn't mean that India is driven by them. I think it recognizes, and surely you will hear more from Jeff Piot about this, that any role that it plays in Afghanistan, beyond the economic and social reconstruction role it's now playing, would cause problems for the coalition in the NATO U.S.-led coalition. But Indian policy is rarely driven, to say the least, by concern about stepping on Pakistan's corns.
Thank you. Teresita, you mentioned India's focus on the Middle East and the importance of oil. China is also very much interested in the oil situation in the Middle East. Do you see that the competition, or do you see that the need for energy to keep both of their economies growing are going to make these two countries basically look at the whole oil situation as a zero-sum game, or is there some way that you might see the two countries trying to cooperate on the energy front?
Excellent question. The theoretical answer to your question is that India and China have decided that they're going to be cooperative. They've even signed a memorandum of understanding to that effect. My perception, watching the way they've actually behaved, is that cooperation has lasted precisely as long as it was convenient to both sides. And that in general, insofar as the international oil game involves tying up equity positions and preferred supplier arrangements, China has outplayed India in that field. The example that really sticks in my mind has to do with Burma, where India thought it was well positioned. It had made a commitment to help build a port in Burma. It was putting funds, one of its companies was putting funds into the development of one of the Burmese gas fields. And a few years ago when we were in Delhi, we had lunch with the then petroleum minister who had just returned from Burma and had been told, oops, we've just committed that field to exports to China. So I think there will be a relationship that is fundamentally one of rivalry. Now, I don't see that really playing out specifically in the Middle East. For one thing, the Middle East oil assets are, for the most part, not up for foreign possession. But I think it definitely colors the way India and China seem to be developing their respective presence and assets in the Indian Ocean. China is helping Pakistan build a port at a place called Gwadar, which is near the China-Iran border. In other words, as close as you can get to the Persian Gulf and still be in Pakistan. Sorry, near the Pakistan-Iran border. And the stated reason for this, if one listens to the Chinese security analysts, is they don't want India or the United States or anybody else to be in a position to interrupt their oil imports. China and India are the two most rapidly growing oil markets in the world. And I think they're going to be watching each other very warily, and both of their dependence on oil is an important part of it. India's policy, if you look at the policy statements, is one of reliance on the market to supply their oil. But a lot of the policy instincts of India's petroleum officials tilt in a more mercantilist direction. We have to get our hands on assets in different countries. We can't let China steal a march on us there. Unfortunately, China has done that in a number of places. So I think you also have a bit of a disconnect between the theoretical policy and the actual policy.
Thank you. Steve, could you give us a quick summary of the relationship that China plays in the India-Pakistan game, particularly the Chinese attitude toward Pakistan and what it's prepared to do or not to do today?
Sure. The opening to China came from Zulfikar Ali Bhutto against the wishes of the Pakistan military, because he saw the United States as an untrustworthy ally, and also he was trying to break up the U.S. relationship with the Pakistani generals. Well, they fired him for doing that. But when he became prime minister, he pushed this through. And the Chinese, I think the Chinese strategically see Pakistan the way they see North Korea. That is a client state or a state of dependency, I won't say client, whose support is useful for a number of reasons. In the case of North Korea and Pakistan, it's useful to make other states nervous. South Korea, Japan, by having an active North Korea, and in the case of South Asia, makes the Indians nervous about having an active Pakistan. So the Pakistanis are, I think they're now the largest beneficiary of Chinese military assistance and technology. Above all, the nuclear program. Clearly that was a major event in world history when the Chinese transferred or facilitated the transfer of nuclear technology to Pakistan, and of course then the Pakistanis, emulating the Chinese, transferred that technology to a whole range of other countries. So I think that, and also secondarily, the Chinese saw Pakistan as a jumping off place for access to the Middle East. So the relationship is described as high as the Himalayas, deep as the ocean, and so forth. But really the Pakistan, what it has meant for the Indians is that the strategic unity of the South Asia has been now interrupted by a Chinese presence in Pakistan for a number of years. And I don't see any way the Indians can remove the Chinese. They've tried being nice to China and nasty to Pakistan. They've tried being nice to Pakistan, nasty to China. Nothing works. I think the Chinese and the Pakistanis see this as a long-term, durable relationship. It may be dysfunctional for China because the Pakistanis have been training inadvertently some Chinese nationals, Islamists, and I think the Chinese are a little bit nervous about this, but they don't see any alternative to this.
Thank you.
But it's worth remembering that the China-Pakistan relationship is not unlimited. In 1999, when Pakistan had troops on the Indian side of the line of control, the Chinese sent their prime minister home from a 6-day visit after a day and a half with a clear message, although they were gracious enough not to put this in the public domain, that China would like their troops out of there.
Well, let me just add to that, too. I think the Pakistanis are curiously willing to live with what they call the enduring entente, this all-weather highway, while at the same time accepting that at crucial points, such as the one Tazy just mentioned, China has not been willing to come to Pakistan's rescue. What I'm saying is that Pakistan is willing to accept behavior from the Chinese, which it surely would not accept from the United States.
Thank you. Okay, it's your turn. Jag.
Question for Steve. Steve, do you see re-emergence of military rule in Pakistan?
Reemergence of military.
Rule in Pakistan.
Rule in Pakistan.
Oh, yeah. I think sooner or later it's probably going to happen. Yeah,
And
there's
what's your estimate of timing for that?
Well, I don't think they want, their view is uniformly that this is an incompetent civilian government in Pakistan, but they don't expect another civilian government to be more competent. And they know, or they're learning, as I told Kiani and others, that while they won't let civilians rule effectively, they can't run the country themselves. So I think you'll probably see you'll probably see the model repeat itself, another spell of military rule. That won't change the system in Pakistan. In a sense, it's a rotation of civil and military elites. But they're heading towards, not in the next 5 years, but after that, a more profound transformation as the society changes. It's more than 50% urban and becoming increasingly Islamized.
Can I just follow up on that? If the military rule comes in Pakistan, will that change the triad relationship between Pakistan, China, and India, as it almost happened in the last military rule in some fashion?
No, I don't think so. I think the Indians would actually like to deal with the military regime directly. Some Indians would. They also don't have faith that Pakistan can produce a strong civilian government. Then the Chinese will certainly accept it. They're not interested in democratization in any sense. But the problem would come with the Americans because of the Kerry Lugar and other legislation has all kinds of provisions on this. But I think Jeff Piatt and others will be inventive enough to keep the relationship going if it can be kept ongoing. But I'm more concerned about the relationship breaking, which in some ways would be good for both countries because we're too much in each other's pockets.
Okay,
So, do you think that the secular democracy and Islam in its pure form, they are compatible?
Is secular democracy?
Is the secular democracy and secular democratic form of government and Islam in its pure form, they are compatible?
In other words, India-Pakistan relations.
So no, because Pakistan is an Islamic state.
Or within Pakistan.
No, so is the secular democratic form of government and Islam in its ideologically, in its pure form, they are compatible. Do you think so? What do you think? What's your take?
Let me give you a course in comparative politics in 4 words, or 8 words. Nations are ideas and states are bureaucracies. And a good nation, a good idea can function properly, but it has to have the support of a reasonably competent state. India has pretty much both, and the idea of India works. Pakistan is still groping for an idea that works, whether it should be an Islamic state, whether it should be a Punjabi-dominated state, whether part of its identity should be hostility to India. And that's a fluid debate in Pakistan with no conclusion. But the people who dominate the debate now all wear uniforms, and their view generally is that it's hard to live with India, and part of Pakistan's identity is going to be hostility to India, and vice versa. So Islam is part of this, but the real failure is to coalesce around a workable idea of a religious-based state, or state based on religious identity. The Israelis have this problem also, but not to the extent that Pakistan has.
Okay.
So the answer is yes and no.
Okay.
Tom Arthur.
Thank you. I'd like to ask the panel a question I last asked in the American Embassy in New Delhi 9 years ago, and compare your answer to what I got there. The India-Pakistan antagonism is very reminiscent to my eyes of the Palestinian-Israeli antagonism in its sort of apparent intractability and a never-ending state. Is there any way to normalize a relationship between these two countries? Is there anything one could give to the other that would ultimately create a peace there? And if so, what is it?
Let me try answering that one. I think it'll be very difficult to normalize relationships in the sense that we usually use the term normalization. There is deep suspicion in Pakistan of Indian intentions, of Indians' acceptance of the idea of Pakistan. There are long-term problems with Kashmir at the head of the long list, which the two countries have failed effectively to deal with. In my view, the best chance for real progress towards normalization can come from strong governments in both New Delhi and Islamabad, because it's only then that the governments of India and Pakistan will be willing to make the concessions that they've got to make as they move towards a normalization of ties. But it's going to be very difficult. There are deep suspicions. There are also, and Steve may want to comment more on this, there are people in both countries, and especially in Pakistan, who have a vested interest in poor relations. You got to ask yourself, let's say, miraculously, after 64 years, the Kashmir issue is resolved to the satisfaction, more or less, of both sides. Well, how do you go about then, if you're a Pakistan military leader or a Pakistan politician supporting a strong military, to justify the presence of such an outsized army in a country as poverty-stricken as Pakistan? These are all elements which go into the mix. But the bottom line is it's going to be very tough. There are deep suspicions. It used to be said, certainly when I first came to India in the 1960s, that once the generation of Indians and Pakistanis who had gone through the horrors of the 1947 partition had left the political scene, then things would change. And people on both sides of the line would view the other side as a normal country and move towards normalization of relations. Well, that hasn't happened, and frankly, I don't see it happening, certainly not on the Pakistan side.
Can I give a slightly different slant on substantially the same answer? India and Pakistan, if you look in a sort of technocratic sense at their interests, there's a large range of them that actually don't conflict. Their economies are not, in some fundamental sense, rivals. The problem is the identity question. There's a whole string of kind of legacy issues which would be relatively easy to resolve if it were not for the identity question and for the nasty legacy of Kashmir. I think, in a sense, that we know what a solution would look like if they ever got there. The problem is the getting there. Looking at the Kashmir issue, I think that if that's ever resolved, the solution is going to involve very little change in the map, significant changes in the relationship between New Delhi and its side of Kashmir, Islamabad and its side of Kashmir, a major sort of confidence-building effort which would include thinning out the military presence in both places, and some kind of joint institution building that crossed the line in Kashmir. That is basically what the Indian and Pakistani negotiators in the back-channel talks that took place in the last years of the Musharraf government were working toward. The problem is what my husband said about strong governments. You need strong governments to take that kind of idea public and to weather the political storms in both sides about giving away the family jewels. And so that's what I mean when I say that it's the getting there that is the major problem, and I don't see that happening anytime soon.
Yeah,
You want to say something?
yeah. I infer from your question that you know something about the conflict resolution literature. Is that right? I infer you know something about the conflict resolution literature. Is that correct? Or no, you're just drawing the comparison between India, Pakistan, Israel, and Palestine. Yeah, well, those are two examples, and the situation in Sri Lanka is a third, and there may be a few others, of what I've called a paired minority conflict. That is, in both countries, the dominant view is that they represent a threatened minority, even though they may be a physical majority, like the Sinhala in Sri Lanka. And therefore, you can't reach an agreement. They're perpetual motion conflict machines. That is, it will go on forever. And my new book is just started writing it, Shooting for a Century, the India-Pakistan Conundrum. And there's a pun in there. You know, they're shooting, but they're also playing cricket. They're going for a century. So there's an India-Pakistan hostility and probably more conflicts or wars, but also a shared culture and shared values in many ways. But because the perception in both countries, the elite in both countries, is that each side is at a profound disadvantage and faced by a larger threat or an enemy. You're not going to get a resolution. I agree with Charles Kupchan, who's written a book about how enemies become friends, that it takes, first of all, a decision by the elites in both countries, the strong government, and then comes the Kumbaya moment later on. Then comes trade, then comes other things. You have to have a strategic decision on the part of the leadership in both states that conflict isn't worth it. We've got to find a way out of this. And in the case of India and Pakistan, I gave a speech in Canada. I said the two most recalcitrant bureaucracies are the ISI in Pakistan and the MEA in India. In a sense, neither side knows how to budge or wants to budge. And I think that sort of epitomizes the relationship as a whole. So all you have to have is a few spoilers in one on each side to make sure this isn't going to happen. So I think it will go. I think it's going to last 100 years. Only 34 years to go. Yeah.
Okay, we had a question right over here. Let's get a mic to you if we can. Here, it's coming. It's coming right down to you.
I'm Narayanan Komarath. I'm a longtime resident of Atlanta, long enough to have lived here so that I'm more worried about a Pakistani nuclear weapon going off in Atlanta than anywhere in India. I want to welcome you to our beautiful city, and it's a privilege to address this question to 4 ambassadors at a time, but particularly to Dr. Cohen. I'm one of the few, well, I'm sure there are many people who read your website, and I'm one of them. In 2003, thereabouts, your website said that one of your proud achievements was that you had convinced the United States government to adopt General Musharraf as our ally. Yes. Despite his having demonstrated in 1999 that he very nearly triggered a nuclear war. But today, I just visited it courtesy of Emory University's free internet access, and I see that you say, let me make sure I don't misquote you, one of the causes of the current crisis in Pakistan is decades of neglect by the government of its own environment. One cause of the neglect is that the government is ruled by the military. I think that was September 1st of 2010. So that was very much under the present civilian government. Now, you did talk about the opportunity that arose in 1971, and I was a teenager in India, old enough to read newspapers at the time. But in 2001, the US had a terrific opportunity to end the Pakistan problem, which is the real problem, not, in my view, of course, not Kashmir problem.
You're going to get to the question
yes,
very
yes,
soon.
yes,
Right?
I'm getting there. So did the US not miss a great opportunity to bring peace to South Asia in 2001 by destroying the Pakistani military? So my question is this, is it time perhaps for the United States diplomatic establishment and its advisors to rethink this advice that seems to be to go with the one-stop shopping, one phone call does it all, dealings with the dictators? And I really hope that we see a time when we are able to deal with the messy democracies around the world instead of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question.
Yeah, I think that's questions to me. I think if you look, if you buy my Future Idea Pakistan book, you'll see, and look up Pervez Musharraf, you'll see such adjectives as incompetent, over his head, unwise. And so, in a sense, I learned about. As I actually met and talked to him right after at one point, and I realized that the American support for Musharraf, while well-intentioned, was misplaced. And I fought with people in the Bush administration about that. I thought it made a big mistake. Not that you could turn Pakistan into democracy. And the Indians themselves liked Musharraf. They wanted to work with him. So in a sense, it wasn't simply an American problem. But I think that, so I think you read the wrong, what I assume I said that in 2003, but when I finished the book, 2004, and published it, the views are quite different there, as I learned more about the situation. I think the U.S. is in deep trouble in South Asia. And I think that our relationship with Pakistan is going to break. But I don't see the Indians being of any help in this at all. And if you read the Idea of Pakistan book, India is the single most important country as far as Pakistan is concerned. The Indians steer the Pakistan army, and the Pakistan army steers Pakistan. And we can't intervene in that until the Indians make a different policy. I think at the top, the leadership in India understands this. They're trying to find a way to normalize it, but they're attacked as being traitors, as being, coddling Pakistan. So that's why I think the conflict is going to go on indefinitely. And the threat to Atlanta, I think, is real. Well, maybe Chicago would be a more likely threat. I'm from Chicago. That is, the conjunction of a terrorism and loose nuclear weapons is a theoretical but real threat. And if Pakistan loosens and comes apart, I think the first bomb would be on New Delhi. And then after that, we'd get our share of them. In other words, so it's in our interest, and the Indian interest, and the Chinese interest to keep Pakistan together. That's the irony of Pakistan. That if they didn't have the nuclear weapons, I think there was a WikiLeaks report on this, they'd be Congo, or I call it Nigeria without oil. We wouldn't care that much, in a sense. They'd break up and something else would come out of it. But with nuclear weapons, 100+ nuclear weapons, which cannot be scooped up, by anybody, by us or by the Indians or the Israelis, they become a formidable problem. That is, if they did break up. So that's our dilemma.
Other questions? Back in the back there. No, the gentleman right there is standing right by you. Thank you.
Oh, okay, hi.
Identify yourself. I should have been saying that all along. Identify yourself and then ask.
Sure. My name's Anand Shah. I'm a second-year law student here at Emory, and I'm also a researcher. Over here? I'm also a researcher for NATO's Cooperative Cyber Defense Center of Excellence based in Estonia. And I guess my question, and this is for the whole panel, is where do you see India's cybersecurity and sort of cyber warfare capabilities and policy going in the next couple of years? And really the reason for asking, sort of the impetus, is because so much of India's economic development is based on sort of high-level technology. And, of course, we think about Bangalore and that sort of thing. But where do you see India going in the next couple of years? And how does that sort of converge with where NATO and the U.S. currently sort of have their eyes on the challenges that cyber warfare presents? Thanks.
I see India's policy going resolutely in two opposite directions, and I'm not sure how it's all going to get sorted out. On the one hand, there is a very widespread recognition that the information technology and related industries are the goose that's been laying golden eggs for India, the wave of the future, the piece of the cutting-edge global economy where India has really been in a leadership position, and something to be protected at all costs. On the other hand, you have a debate taking place in India which is not unlike the one that's also taking place in the United States, but in India it's being carried on at a higher decibel level. And that is the effort to ensure that the government is able to have real-time access to encrypted traffic on quite understandable security grounds. Most of the press coverage of this has focused on BlackBerry and specifically BlackBerry's enterprise communications, but all of the major purveyors of enterprise communications pose the same problem, that they rely on strong encryption and that's what the Indian government is trying to get at. I think this is a real problem because if you're not careful, focusing only on access to these communications puts at risk a lot of their tremendous and tremendously important success in the IT area. I'm not sure where it's all going to get sorted out because this gets tangled up in personal and bureaucratic rivalries inside the government of India, and it's not really being addressed in a coherent fashion.
Okay, all the way in the back of the room now.
Thank the panel for a very interesting and insightful discussion. I want to take the questioning on a different track altogether.
Before you do that, identify yourself, please.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
Okay.
Identify yourself.
My name is Abhay Mishra. I am a faculty at Georgia State University's College of Business.
Thank you.
There seems to be a lot of focus here in this room and also among the panel members. The focus seems to be between the bilateral relationships between India and Pakistan. And in talking to people all over India, it seems like people are less fascinated with Pakistan than they are with more important countries like the United States. So for people of India, Pakistan is no longer what it used to be 10, 20, 30, 50 years ago. So I'll bring the bilateral relationship discussion between United States and India, the two largest democracies in the world. And as all the panel members have already observed, the bilateral relationships could have been much better, but they're not where you would expect them to be. So if all the panel members had undivided attention of President Obama and Prime Minister Manmohan Singh, what are the three things you would recommend to both of them?
Well, since I've got a book on that subject, which I hope you will buy sitting outside on the table, I will kick off. I think the first thing which has already happened is the continuing development of the Indian economy, because U.S.-India economic ties have just about reached the point where they're going to continue expanding more or less regardless of what the two governments do. And that gives a tremendous stabilizing factor to this very important bilateral relationship. The second recommendation I would make has to do with the bilateral relationship, in other words, the things the U.S. and India do by themselves without others in the room. This is the area where we have had the greatest success stories in the 10-plus years that we have really been working up a partnership. I think we need to amplify the success stories we've already had with much more extensive and candid consultations on what's happening in other parts of the world. This has already begun happening with respect to East Asia. President Obama, when in Delhi, undertook to extend that conversation to the Middle East. I think there's no time like the present for getting that started. And my third recommendation is going to sound mushier, but I think it is definitely something that needs doing. I think that India and the United States need to develop a style that works for this relationship, in which, from India's perspective, they sort out how to reconcile an important relationship with the United States with the very strong commitment to strategic autonomy that has always been a hallmark of Indian foreign policy. In other words, as one of my friends put it, only slightly tongue-in-cheek, India has to be willing to be seen with the United States in public. From the U.S. point of view, we need to develop a style that avoids the implicit assumption that there's a senior and a junior partner in this relationship, because that style doesn't work for India.
Okay, we've got a couple of more questions and then we'll have to call it to an end. Yes, sir, the gentleman right there with the white shirt on.
Hello, my name is Mitra. I'm a first-year MBA student here, and my question is towards the general panel. what can India, China, and Pakistan do in the next 3 to 5 years to increase their growth?
Would you stay? I didn't hear
Did
the
you
question
mean,
well.
did you mean their individual growth or to improve their relations
Well,
between them, which are
Well,
slightly different?
I meant from an economic perspective, the growth rates that we are already seeing, China has about 10%, India is roughly around the same. Is there anything that they can do better to improve their growth rates even further?
I think the answer to that in India, in all three countries, is going to be fundamentally domestic. How they organize their economy, how they deal with the obstacles to economic growth. On the Indian side, this is stuff we talked about yesterday. I'm not enough of a China expert to give you a full description. With respect to Pakistan, for many years, Pakistan grew substantially faster than India. This has not been the case in recent years, and in fact, the Pakistan economy, as we were able to observe when we were there, is under considerable strain. The one bright spot is that agriculture is doing pretty well, in part because of high food prices. But as against that, you have balance of payments pressure, a budget with a hole in it, and a horribly mismanaged energy sector. I think the fundamental pathology, though, is really in the political management of the economy. The economists' answer to this conundrum is that you have to pass on high energy prices to the ultimate consumers of energy. This is something that the government tried to do and then promptly had to rescind its action for political reasons. I think it gets back to having a weak political government that is under enormous pressure, both from political opponents and internationally, and is devoting all of its energies to staying in power, and that has significantly reduced its ability to take unpopular measures. I think this is one of a huge number of challenges that government is dealing with. I think it's going to continue to be under pressure for some time.
One thing that would surely help the Pakistan economy, in my view, is improved trade relations and investment opportunities with India. There has been some increase in trade, but it's a difficult thing, and there is a strong political presumption in Pakistan that somehow this is not good for Pakistan. Let me tell you an interesting story that we heard when we visited Mumbai a couple of weeks ago. We were talking to one of the leaders of the Mahindra & Mahindra concern, one of those brand names that came up frequently in the conversation yesterday. One of the things they do is to build tractors, which are certainly world-class tractors. They recently acquired a factory in China which produced tractors, and they changed these tractors to their own specification. The issue came up, how about exporting these tractors to Pakistan? And this made a lot of sense. Not only was this a very good and inexpensive tractor, but the company manufactured them in Indian Punjab, not that far from the Pakistan border. And a civilian official in Pakistan was very enthusiastic about an arrangement which seemed to make an awful lot of sense. This, however, was vetoed at the political level. There, the elected official who dealt with the issue said, well, we really can't import from eastern Punjab. What about importing these tractors from the factory in China where the Indians manufacture them? 1,000, 1,500 miles away instead of a few hours drive to the border where they can cross. This is the kind of thing which constantly hinder efforts to improve relations in trade and relations more generally.
Okay, one last question because of the time. Okay, lady right there. Yes, here.
And I would like to know what is India's strategy when it comes to Africa, and how do you think that would influence its relationship with China? Because for them, they see Africa as a great resource, a great market for resources, and how they're actually working with the local governments there. So I would love your comments on that.
I don't have figures at the tip of my fingers. I do know that India's commercial presence in Africa has expanded, and in particular, the pharmaceutical companies have been quite successful there. India has a modest budget for aid in Africa. These do not begin to approach the scale of China's involvement in Africa. Also, China has been, I am told, quite willing to deploy the power of government and, for example, its foreign aid program in order to secure resource deals. India has not been in that game, nor does it have the resources that China does. So basically, they're pursuing different models. I am sure that their policy in theory is that they want to be cooperative with China. I'm equally sure that that's not where they're headed. But I wouldn't write off India's ability to be quite successful on the commercial front. And I think as India's economy becomes more integrated with the rest of the world, this is going to increasingly be and be seen as a success worth having in its own right.
Well, I think our panelists have proved that they are indeed real experts on the area. Would you join me in showing our appreciation to the Schaffers and Steve Cohen? Let me just remind you of the remainder of the day's program. We're going to have a box lunch right out in the atrium here. And then at 1 o'clock, Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State Jeff Pyatt will talk to us about U.S.-India relations. And then this afternoon, Steve Cohen is going to talk to us more about the military, focused on some of the arguments that he makes in his book. And then at the last session of the afternoon, we will have businessmen from U.S. firms working in India and Indian firms working in the United States talking about mutual business opportunities under the moderation of Jag Sheth. So have a nice lunch. Let's be back in here at 1 o'clock for Jeff Pyatt's address to us. Thank you very much.
The preceding program is copyrighted by Emory University.